Imagine trusting a man who dedicated his life to helping others, only to learn years later that he may have been a predator hiding in plain sight. That's exactly what happened in Denver, Colorado. When Emily Carter disappeared in 2004, her family believed the entire city was fighting to bring her home. But 20 years later, the shocking truth came out. The same man who led vigils and search parties is now accused of being responsible for her vanishing, and possibly dozens more. This case isn't just about a missing woman. It's about how evil can disguise itself as kindness, and how a city was ridiculously blindsided by the monster it trusted most. Before we dive deeper to uncover the story, hit subscribe for more unsolved cold cases and chilling mysteries. The morning Emily Carter disappeared, Denver smelled like rain and burnt coffee. It was October, the city still clinging to the last lazy heat of summer, while the Rockies wore their first dusting of frost. Emily left her apartment on Colfax with a battered tote, a thermos, and a smile fit for another ordinary day. She kissed her mother on the cheek, told her brother she'd be home late, and promised Sarah, her best friend, she'd bring back sticky cinnamon rolls from the little bakery on 17th. That was the last ordinary thing anyone could pin to her. She was 26. She worked at a clinic that helped women who had slipped through the cracks, addicts, survivors, girls who'd been turned away by the system. She was the sort of person who took details seriously. The way collars sat, how people folded their hands when they lied. She believed in names and in small mercies. She had a laugh that made people soften. When she didn't come back that night, it was the sort of thing that later seemed to split time into before Emily and after Emily. The first 72 hours of a missing person case feel like standing in a doorway while a storm gathers. Neighbors called, officers knocked on doors, pale flyers went up on telephone poles in the rain. Linda Carter, Emily's mother, lived in a house that had become its own kind of evidence. Photos of Emily on every surface, a coffee mug she never used, tissues buried in the sofa. Mark, her brother, grew small and furious. Sarah kept replaying their last conversation until she could feel its edges fray. Detective Jonah Pierce, who took the case, described the scene as shock silence, which meant the city was holding its breath and the press smelled blood. But there was no body, no ransom note, no sign of a scuffle. Emily's phone was found 2 blocks from her apartment near a park bench. Battery drained, screen cracked from a fall, a single lipstick smear on the corner. Her tote was by the coffee shop on 17th, with receipts tucked inside and a folded city bus timetable. Cameras in the neighborhood had given cops nothing. It was 2004. Cameras were grainy, angles sparse. Witnesses remembered a tall man in a gray coat checking his watch, a delivery truck with a faded logo backing up. Each memory came as if someone had whispered it too late, half-formed, unable to fit into the tidy box of a timeline. The first years were all momentum and mistakes. The police followed leads that evaporated. A man with a violent past told the police he'd seen Emily get into a car with a boyfriend. The boyfriend had an alibi. A neighbor confessed to spying on Emily at night, but he offered nothing definitive. A priest said Emily had confided in him about something dangerous. The priest refused to name specifics. The clinic Emily worked at was questioned, co-workers were interviewed, and the safe spaces she built around other people were splayed open for scrutiny. People pointed fingers at addiction, at bad choices, at the wrong neighborhood. The city offered sympathy in statements, and then, when the case cooled, complacency. Years blurred. Linda became a fixture outside police stations, a woman who could stand on a sidewalk and still look like she belonged in someone else's house. Mark grew a beard and a bitterness that sat under his eyes like a shadow. Sarah moved away, writing letters to herself to remind her how to breathe. Detective Pierce retired, as men with gray at their temples do, shaking hands and leaving evidence boxes behind him like a graveyard of possibilities. The news cycle turned. New tragedies arrived, older ones faded. But grief has its persistence. Linda kept a calendar on her kitchen wall, where every day Emily was missing was circled in red. The circled days multiplied into years, and the calendar became a map of absence. 2 decades later, a single new piece of technology, the sort that promises miracles and delivers stumbling truth, stirred the cold case into motion. It was genetic genealogy, a technique that had unraveled other mysteries by connecting relatives through DNA fragments. A small swab from a coffee cup found near the park bench where Emily's phone was recovered had remained in a plastic evidence wrapper, a relic. The cup had been retested in 2023 as part of a city initiative to clear cold files, and 2 technicians with steady hands and a faith in algorithms pulled a strand of someone's life from it, a partial profile that, when run through open-source databases, led to a family tree that ended at one person, Adrian Vale. If the name meant nothing to the city, that was only because Belmont, the neighborhood where Adrian had built his life, was a quiet, generous place. He had founded Second Light, a nonprofit that had started as a 2-room shelter for women and grown into something larger, a community center, a mission. He raised funds at luncheons and stood on stages with microphones and shoulders squared. He spoke at vigils for victims. He gave Emily a letter of recommendation when she applied to a social work program. He donated to the clinic where she worked. He sat on panels about trauma and recovery. When Emily vanished, Adrian was one of the men who led search parties. He read the names on flyers under the floodlights of the first night. He hugged Linda in public and wept in the way the faithful sometimes do. The news of the arrest hit like a thunderclap precisely because of that pedigree. People in the city who had once applauded Adrian's speeches, who had eaten sandwiches at Second Light's fundraising bazaars, felt a sharp, physical betrayal. He was, to many, the sort of man who was the last person they would imagine doing harm. Which is why, when the headline said "Arrest Shocks Denver," no one was surprised they were shocked. Detective Maya Reyes had inherited the case. She was one of those detectives who carried the old boxes of paper like heirlooms and who'd built a career re-examining the things the city had said were no longer worth attention. She was patient and rigorous. She did not believe in closure that came in press conferences. The genetic lead came to her as a whisper, a distant relative match, a lineage that snaked into names, addresses, and a man with a nonprofit letterhead. She pushed quietly. She subpoenaed financial records. She worked with genealogists in the evenings and let her team breathe until they had the outline of a story that made sense. The case against Adrian did not come from a single cinematic confession or a dramatic CCTV moment. It came from pattern, from proximity, from inconsistencies that previous investigators had missed. Adrian's schedule did not entirely match his narratives. He volunteered to run certain errands on garish nights when he said he would be with donors. The coffee cup DNA placed him at the bench the night Emily's phone went dark. A search of his van, a mobile office he used to ferry supplies to the shelter, revealed a folded scarf with fibers that matched a microscopic analysis of trace hair found in Emily's tote. There were financial irregularities in Second Light's ledgers, payments to a shell contractor, a rental agreement for a storage unit Adrian used that coincided with the week Emily disappeared. Most damning to the detectives and to Linda, who watched like a hawk, were the emails, archived messages between Adrian and a former employee of the clinic that suggested Adrian had been warned about a woman who knew too much. In court, Adrian's defense painted a portrait of a man who made mistakes out of the blue light of compassion. Crossed wires, poor judgment, poor paperwork. He had skeletons, they said, but not murder. He had his own vulnerabilities. They evoked the kind of nuance that makes juries waver. That Adrian, they argued, was the type of man who would embrace the city like a father, and therefore the least likely. The prosecution assembled a different tableau. A man who used his public persona as camouflage, who had precisely the access and the power to move around without notice, who had been present at too many crucial moments to be merely sympathetic. The arrest itself was a scene out of an antediluvian thriller. It happened at a gala, a fundraising event under shimmering chandeliers, where linen and laughter met in the same breath. Adrian, in a tux and a smile that had long ago become a part of his image, stood by a table arranging a speech about second chances. Maya and her team took him in quietly. Cameras in the room stung. Phones trembled with disbelief. Linda watched from the back, a steady, hollow stare behind the small crowd of donors. Emily's photo, the one with her hair unruly and her smile wide, had been placed on a pedestal at the stage, a silent accusation. In the months that followed, the city fractured along predictable lines. Some people refused to believe that a man who fed the hungry could also be a perpetrator. Others wanted the simplicity of a culprit to blame for a grief that had been wronged for years. Protesters gathered outside the shelter, some to protect Adrian's legacy, others to demand that the victims who had come to second light be considered collateral. Linda felt something close to vindication and something worse, the realization that justice, even when it arrived, could not rust away the years she had lost with her daughter. There was elation in the Carter household. The law had finally moved, but it was brittle, like a victory that had not been allowed to be loud. The trial was long because justice, in this city, had to be meticulous. Emily's friends, who had once been private citizens stitched together by grief, now found themselves testifying about small things that suddenly felt enormous. A bruised wrist she had hidden, a journal entry where she had scratched a name and then crossed it out, an offhand mention of a man who asked too many questions about what she was doing at the clinic. The prosecution called witnesses who had been in and out of Second Light's orbit, women who had once applauded Adrian for giving them structure, who now testified to late-night phone calls, to sudden disappearances from the shelter, to a fear that the men in charge were not always the protectors they pretended to be. The defense called expert witnesses and painted those same women as resentful, as unreliable, as motivated by revenge. It felt, at times, like watching a city argue with itself. There was a piece of evidence that made people stop talking, an audio file pulled from an old voicemail box that Emily had kept. It was compressed and grainy, but it held a bite of certainty. "He knows," Emily had said, voice tight, maybe more than once. "He knows what I saw." There was no name. The voicemail ended with a sound like a chair scraping or a door, something ordinary that then felt monstrous. The defense said audio artifacts could be mistaken. But to Linda, to Mark, to Sarah, it sounded like Emily, brave and terrified and fed up. When Adrian stood, finally, to give a statement, he did not scream or break down. He spoke with a measured tone, a man whose public life had taught him the cadence of contrition. He denied intent. He lamented the pain left in the wake of Emily's disappearance. He spoke of redemption as if it were a doctrine and of ambiguity as if it were a bomb. The jurors listened. The city watched. Inside the courthouse, the air tasted of breath held too long. The conviction, when it came, was not a roaring declaration, but a collapse, a chair, a muted cry, a hand over a mouth. Guilty on several counts that, even when spelled out with legal exactness, never captured the precise cruelty of that night. Adrian was sentenced, and the sentence read like a ledger balancing a debt that cannot be balanced. He received years that might make a number on a paper, but could never return the laughter or the cinnamon rolls or the unspent potential of a life clipped by fear. But the court could not produce Emily. There was no body, no map that led to a neat, humane closure. Linda received, eventually, a black envelope with a single scrap, a map of an old storage unit where Adrian kept what he called supplies. In it were boxes of gloves, a ledger, memories, and, among dust and tissues and news clippings, a small, silver locket with a photograph of Emily inside, edges worn like a secret. It was the kind of thing that wrapped grief tighter around the wound, proof that she had been there, close enough to be memorialized, and then taken away. In the weeks after the verdict, the neighborhood around Second Light held its breath. Some tried to hold together the threads Adrian had spun into the community, arguing the shelter's mission should be preserved. Others wanted the doors closed. Linda went on television once, brittle and earnest. She had a single message for the city: find the others. Find them. Don't let this be the end. But a conviction, even a headline that declared justice served, does not erase suspicion. Old wounds reopened. People who had given money to Adrian awkwardly apologized into their phones. Women who had once trusted him now counted their nights in the shelter, like a person counting the floors between them and escape. Investigators reopened boxes and files and phones, not out of curiosity, but because when one person is revealed to be capable of harm, the suspicion spreads like mildew, and the city knows enough to listen. Detective Maya Reyes became, in quieter circles, a figure of restless practicality. She had sat in courtrooms and in Linda's kitchen and had traced back the time Emily disappeared in lines on scrap paper that looked like spiderwebs. She took no pleasure in the conviction. She held the case like a ledger she had to balance with ethics and doubt. There were nights she dreamt of Emily's laugh and woke with the phantom smell of cinnamon. For Maya, the case was a lesson in the slow accrual of truth. Sometimes justice arrives as a drip, not a deluge. Outside the courtroom, people fought over what the arrest meant about trust. Was the city wrong to have loved Adrian? Had they been naive? Had they let themselves be fooled because his rhetoric was warm and his hands were clean in public? The answers were messy. For every person who felt betrayed, there was someone who insisted on nuance. For every person who wanted to shutter the shelter, there was someone who demanded aid not be politicized. It was a conversation made of grief, fear, and the human need to find a story in what had been foolishly large and then suddenly small. Sarah, who had once clung to the hope that Emily would someday walk back through the front door with flower in her hair and a story to tell, moved slowly back into the world. She tried to make art again, a way of turning memory into a shape. Mark lost weight and found it again in hollow cycles. Linda, who had become known for her relentless pursuit, began volunteering at a center for families of missing people. She met others who carried calendars with red circles. Their pain was a braided rope, tied in knots they had to unknot together. There were moments that cut and moments that healed. The city lit a vigil for Emily each year, not to declare an ending, but to insist memory mattered. People lit candles, read names, listened to songs the way one listens for small salvations. In the crowd, someone would always bring cinnamon rolls, as if offering pastry could stitch time into a gentler seam. The story of Emily Carter reached beyond legal files and into the everyday business of how communities rebuild after betrayal. It became a cautionary tale and a lesson in watchfulness. The people who stand on stages can be gods and monsters. Charity can mask the appetite of predators, and kindness can be weaponized as camouflage. Yet it also taught a simpler, harder truth, that heroes are not always those who wear suits. The heroes who held the line were ordinary. The lab techs who refused to give up on a swab, the genealogists who followed the coldest of clues, the neighbor who remembered a license plate years later and wrote it down. They were small, stubborn people who believed that a missing person was not a file, but a person whose absence had weight. In the months after, there were other discoveries. A storage unit with boxes that suggested Adrian kept tokens, little signs that he had been meticulous about controlling narratives. A few women came forward with stories of late-night conversations, of a man who asked too many questions about their past hurts. None of these stories provided the body. None of them brought Emily back. The trial's victory was a ledger entry, not a resurrection. There was one late afternoon years after the arrest, when Linda sat at Emily's favorite window and pressed the locket to her lips. The city outside moved with a kind of stupid business that had learned to survive tragedies. Children played, a bus hissed, and at the pastry shop down the block someone dropped a tray and cursed, and life continued, as it always does. Linda wondered at the strange alchemy of that, how small cruelties and large kindnesses could coexist on the same street. She wondered how many other names were written into calendars like hers, circling the days their loved ones had been taken. "It's not closure," she said one evening to Maya, who had stopped by with coffee she had no right to ask for. "But it's something. It's a line drawn in the dirt, so the next time they try to erase someone, at least someone will dig." Maya listened, then put a hand over Linda's and held it there, ordinary and warm. "We'll keep digging," she said. "We always do." The arrest of Adrian Vale would be written about in newspaper columns and debated on radio talk shows. Some would say the city had been naive. Some would say the system finally worked. Others would question how many people like Adrian might still go unnoticed. The thing the headlines could not capture, and perhaps never could, was the slow, private calculus of cooling a body's absence into something people could live with. Justice did not repair everything. It simply turned the light toward a face and said, "Finally, you were seen." Emily's story, in the end, did not become a neat parable. It remained a wound and an instruction. It taught the city about the ugliness that can live behind the kindest smiles, about the power of small details held steady over years, about the dignity of those who refused to let a missing person become a mere statistic. It taught that every time someone refused to accept silence, it mattered. And somewhere in the quiet of Linda's kitchen, a calendar still hung. The days were circled, red as ever. It was a map of absence, but also a map of insistence. People came by sometimes and left flowers. On anniversaries, Sarah baked cinnamon rolls and gave them out to strangers who looked like they might need one. It was not closure, not exactly. It was a way to keep the story upright, to keep remembering that a life had been here, loud and particular, and that even in the terrible aftermath, the city had chosen, however reluctantly, to hold onto her name. The winter after Adrian Vale's conviction was the coldest Denver had seen in years. The city groaned under ice, streets turned brittle, and even the mountains seemed sharper against the sky. But for the Carter family, the season wasn't measured in snowfall. It was measured in revelations that came like small, unwelcome ghosts. Because even though the trial had ended and the sentence had been handed down, Adrian Vale's shadow had not vanished. Detective Maya Reyes was the first to see it. She had kept the storage unit files open, revisiting every receipt, every ledger. It wasn't obsession, she told herself, it was duty. There were too many unanswered questions. Why Adrian had rented multiple units under different aliases. Why he had taken trips to rural Colorado in the weeks after Emily disappeared. Why women whispered of things they had never dared put in writing. She believed there was more. One night, as the wind howled through her apartment, Maya spread maps across her table. Dates and places. Disappearances in the Denver metro area between 2002 and 2005. She circled them one by one. There were names she didn't recognize, women whose photos had yellowed in old case files, whose families had moved away and stopped calling. 5 in total. 5 women who had, like Emily, vanished without a trace. The chill deepened. When she visited Linda Carter with this new possibility, Linda did not flinch. She sat with her coffee, her hand trembling just once before it steadied. "You're saying my daughter wasn't the only one," she whispered. Maya nodded. Linda's lips pressed tight. "I always knew," she said after a pause. "Men like him don't just stop. Emily was not his first, and she won't be his last." Word of this theory began to leak, and with it came a new storm of fear. Families who had long buried their grief called the precinct, begging to know if their daughters had been touched by Adrian's reach. Reporters haunted the courthouse, sniffing for a new headline. Adrian himself, sitting in his cell, gave nothing. No confession, no denial, just silence. Then came the letter. Linda received it on a Wednesday, tucked in her mailbox with no return address. The handwriting was steady, masculine. The words were deliberate. "I never meant for Emily to become the story. She wasn't supposed to resist. But she knew too much, and I couldn't risk it. She wasn't the only one, and you've already guessed that. They're still out there. You'll never find them all. But you'll always wonder." It was signed with a single A. Linda's knees gave out in the kitchen. When Maya arrived minutes later, summoned by Mark's panic call, she read the letter twice and felt the room tighten. Forensic teams dusted it, swabbed it, analyzed the ink. The results were inconclusive. It could have been Adrian. It could have been someone imitating him. Either way, the letter reopened every wound. Denver, once again, was gripped by terror. Maya returned to the storage unit, this time prying deeper into the back, where cracked cardboard boxes sagged under mildew. Inside one box, she found what she had prayed she wouldn't: Polaroids. Dozens of them. Women smiling, unaware, standing outside shelters, bus stops, grocery stores. Some were dated, some were not. In one, Emily's hair blew across her cheek as she walked near the clinic. Another photo showed a woman Maya recognized from a missing persons report in 2003, her eyes looking past the camera as if she had already sensed it. The photographs were trophies. The city prosecutor called for calm, but calm was a fantasy. people demanded answers. How could a man so beloved, so trusted, have stalked the city for years? How many women were missing because of him? And the darkest question of all, had Adrian acted alone? Rumors surfaced of accomplices, men who had worked at Second Light, who had left quietly when questions got too close, who had access to vans and storage keys. Their names were whispered on street corners, muttered in bars. Some swore they had seen Adrian meeting with others late at night, exchanging envelopes. Maya could not shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. On one of her late drives through Denver, she stopped outside the shuttered Second Light building. Snow gathered in heaps against the locked doors. She sat in her car, headlights washing the bricks. The building looked different now, not a place of refuge, but a tomb of secrets. She thought of the women who had once walked through those doors, hopeful, searching for safety, and how some of them may never have walked back out. That night she dreamed of Emily again. Not the Emily from photographs, but a version with hollow eyes, standing in the corner of Maya's room whispering, "Find them. Don't let him keep them." Maya woke drenched in sweat, her hands clawing for her notebook. And then came the final, chilling discovery. In January 2025, a maintenance worker cleaning out a condemned property in Commerce City, 20 minutes from downtown Denver, pried open a sealed basement crawl space. Inside were 3 rusted metal trunks. Police were called. Maya was on the scene before the sun rose. When the trunks were opened, the smell of decay was unmistakable. Inside were women's belongings, jewelry, scarves, a pair of shoes, and scraps of fabric with initials sewn into them. Among the items was a faded driver's license. The name, Emily Carter. The license alone was enough to make Linda collapse when she saw it. After 20 years of not knowing, here was proof that Adrian had kept a piece of Emily, a reminder of ownership. But there were also other items belonging to women who had never been connected to him. The evidence confirmed what Maya had feared. Adrian had not just killed once. He had hunted. He had collected. The chilling part was what they didn't find. No bodies. Just belongings stripped from their owners, stored like relics. It was as if Adrian had wanted to erase the women entirely, leaving only fragments behind to haunt the living. The press erupted. The trophies of a predator. One headline screamed. Others called him Denver's hidden monster. Adrian himself, when told of the discovery, only smiled in court, a slow, curling grin that unsettled even the guards. It was a smile that said, "You still don't know everything." And maybe they never would. The final vigil for Emily was held that February. Hundreds gathered in Civic Center Park, candles flickering against the frost. Linda stood at the front, clutching the silver locket with Emily's photo. She spoke with a voice that trembled but did not break. "My daughter's story is no longer just hers. It belongs to every woman who was silenced, every family who still waits for answers. Adrian Vale tried to take everything from us, but we still have her name. And as long as we have her name, he cannot win." The crowd murmured Emily's name in unison, over and over, until the sound rose like a storm against the night sky. Yet even as the candles burned low and people drifted home, a darker truth lingered. The discovery of the trunks had only deepened the mystery. Who were the other women? Where were their bodies? And was Adrian the mastermind, or merely the face of something larger, a network that thrived in the shadows of Denver? Maya stared out over the vigil, her breath fogging in the cold. She knew the case would never truly close. Because every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear Emily's voicemail. "He knows what I saw." And the most chilling part of all was that Denver had no guarantee Adrian was the only one who knew. The story ended not with relief, but with dread. A city forever haunted by the possibility that others like Adrian Vale still walked its streets, smiling, trusted, hiding behind kindness, waiting for the next Emily Carter. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.